When we think about audience awareness and audience analysis, it seems like a pretty simple question. Whom are you trying to convince? On the other hand, if you've got that audience analysis heuristic in front of you, and I hope you do, I've got it pulled up on my screen. If you don't have it, pause, pull it up, and then come back. When you look at that, you can see there are sort of a comprehensive, complicated list of questions to work through. This heuristic works just like every other heuristic that we've worked with. It's just a tool to help you consciously think about all of the things that you need to have in order to make an effective argument going forward, or to analyze an argument that's coming to you. But coming back to it specifically, as you look at those questions, you may find that there are things that in a face-to-face communication you would do without thinking about at all. For example, imagine you had an issue that you wanted to convince a number of different people on, and let's say that you were doing those convincings separately. So in one session, you're going to try to convince your parents. In another session, you're going to try to convince your best friends. In another session, you're going to try to convince some peers that you don't really know very well. And then maybe you want to try to convince somebody that is from a very different background from you, and you know that automatically. My guess is you're going to alter the language that you use, maybe some of the evidence and the persuasion tools and the reasons for whatever it is that you want to convince these people of. I'm making this assumption, you're going to change the way you talk to all of those people based on what you know about them. You want to do the same thing in your writing. And writers, good writers, people that hopefully are trying to convince you, have made the same calculation. They think a lot about what does the person that I'm dealing with probably bring to the text, and then also what do they know, what do they need from me in order to come to see the clear light that I have seen. I hope that you've chosen a topic that you care about. I hope that you are coming to a position that you believe in based on the evidence that you've seen. And you really do want to make everybody else believe what you believe. Now you need to ask yourself, what do they need to get there? The questions that you see on the first page of that audience analysis heuristic are the kinds of things that you are going to calculate automatically in a face-to-face conversation. Take number 1, for example, demographic information, age and generation. Okay, why does that matter? Why does it matter what generation somebody belongs to? What sort of biases do they probably have? What are their political affiliations? How do they vote? How did they used to vote? If you're talking to somebody from the baby boomer generation or from the World War II generation, do they have the same biases and values? Versus if you're talking to a millennial, how would you pitch that argument differently? Advertisers know this for sure. You should know it too, as you read other people's arguments and as you read your own. Thinking about gender or race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, education level, political affiliations that you know of, their philosophies. We talked quite a bit about how foundational philosophies can really affect the arguments that you are receptive to and the ones that you're completely closed off to. Religious affiliation. You're dealing with an ethical issue in your project 4, and a person's religious affiliation is going to come into play almost more than anything else when it comes to that kind of issue. Civic engagement level. How much do they really engage with conversations about public policy? Are they likely voters? Is this person someone who knows a lot about the inner workings of the public forum, or is this somebody who's generally more apathetic? Knowing all of that changes how you phrase yourself, what kind of evidence you use, and being able to figure out who you think a writer is writing to in terms of those things is also going to change the way that you can analyze their argument. If you think they're writing to someone other than you, then that affects the way that you feel about them. Now you notice there are 2 columns on that sheet. One of them is just to fill out what information you know about your audience. The other side is the meaning of the data. Here, it does sort of feel like we're making perhaps some assumptions. I think I would prefer to think of that as a hypothesis, the potential. If somebody belongs to a particular demographic in terms of generation, potentially how might that influence what their biases are and what you need to give them. If someone is one gender or another, how does that potentially influence the way that they receive the data that you're going to give them, or the arguments, or the language that you're going to give them? If somebody belongs to a particular religion or doesn't, or feels warmly toward the idea of religion or coolly toward the idea of religion, how is that going to affect the argument that you're going to make? Okay, so this first page, while you want to take it into account when you're reading research, that's going to be something that's very useful for you, and we will be going through it as an assignment as you work on your project 4 once you start crafting your argument. This week, while we're just introducing the heuristic and using it for argument analysis, we really want to focus on the second page. So the intersections of argument and audience. And this is something that you can absolutely apply to what you read. It's what you will do when you're going through potentially what your argument will be this week in the discussion forum, and as you do your journals, looking at the readings in the video that I have you watch. Going through this, it's the same basic format. So collecting information on the left side and then meaning of data, potential meanings of the data on the right side. And you can answer these just sort of in a 1 and 2 for each of these columns as you're writing. But what we're going to look at are questions of the argument's applicability, the argument's saturation, its value, the entrenchment, and then the kinds of appeals that are there, and then also as you're writing your argument you want to think about that might be there, and then the question of common ground. I'm going to go through just kind of a discussion of what each of those means. Before we do, though, I want to talk to you about the word stakeholders. So that's something that you see used in this assignment, and it's something that we're going to use a lot as we continue to talk about argument. A stakeholder is essentially somebody who holds a stake, somebody who has a reason to care about the argument that you're making, or an interest in the issue. And I don't just mean they find it exciting. I mean they stand to benefit or they stand to lose based on the argument you're making. You want to identify, because you're making an argument that you believe in and that will potentially require change, you want to think about who is the change going to affect and who is it that I need to convince to agree with me in order to get the change I want. Those are the stakeholders. So the first thing you want to do is identify who those people are before you start trying to identify what they want. That's what the second page is all about. Who cares about it? Who do you need to convince? Who do you need to reach? All right. So first question is argument's applicability. To whom does the argument apply? Who are the stakeholders? Is this something that you could say everyone is a stakeholder in? If you're trying to make an argument about global warming, for example, everyone has an interest in that argument because everyone stands to benefit or to lose depending on the planet's environment and its health. On the other hand, specifically with the argument you're going to take, who stands to gain and lose the most from the argument you're making that you need to convince in order to get what you want to happen. Okay? So be very clear as you come up with your purpose statements next week exactly what it is you want to see happen, specifically what you're arguing for. Then you want to talk about saturation. How much has this issue saturated the culture? How much does the average person on the street, and I know that that's kind of a broad thing to say, but how much is your average reader likely to know about the issue? Is it obscure, or is it something that everyone's heard of? If it's kind of a niche thing, if it's not something that everybody knows about, and you think people should know about it, what do they need to know? What do you need to give them in order to get them up to the level of awareness that you need them to have in order to make your argument? On the other hand, if everybody knows about it, what new do you have to say? You need to know about this before you go on. Argument's value. And that doesn't just mean how much do you think it's worth. That means how much do people generally care about this? And why do they care about it? Why don't they care about it? Is this something that lots of people don't care about, but that you think they absolutely should? There's a really good video, again, from John Oliver, very much like the video that I gave to you to watch this week, that came out early in his show's run that deals with the question of net neutrality. The whole thesis of his argument there is that Americans don't care about this as much as they should, and that the people who stand to profit by it use that apathy, that lack of caring, in order to get the point across. Now, I haven't assigned that video for you to watch, but if you're writing about something that you think people should care more about than they do, he does a good example of laying out how to convince people, yes, you do need to care about this issue. And that's easily available on YouTube if you do a search for it. Arguments entrenchment. This one is something to definitely think about when choosing a topic. How firm are people's opinions about this issue that you're taking on? Classic example here is abortion. Truly, almost any of the sort of 100 most debatable topics, if you Googled that to look for topics, consider perhaps that many of those are things that people are already entrenched in. How flexible are people? How firm are they? And I'm going to come back to the abortion debate. Typically, this doesn't yield a very good research paper from most people who take it on, and the reason is most people have a decided position they're not planning to budge from, and it's been argued so much that by this point, the arguments have been made. And what new do you have to say that's going to move somebody from one side of that line to the other? People tend to be less rational, less moved by logic when it's an entrenched argument because they've got lines of reasoning that fit with their foundations, that fit with their biases already, and you're not going to be budging anybody. Often you want to avoid these issues. If you are stepping into one of those fields, though, where people are really embattled, then think about what it is that you can say that might move people from one side of the line to the other. Be very careful with that kind of topic. Arguments appeals. Now this often has to do with thinking about the analysis of something you've read, but you also want to think about the appeals you'll need to make. Logic, emotion, based on an individual person's ethics or characteristics. What is that person's character? How good are they? What is the ethos there? Here, often in academic writing, we see logic as the strongest argument, and we tend to distrust emotional appeals. Pay attention as you're reading. How emotional is the language? How emotional is the tone of the piece that you're looking at? How emotional is the tone you're taking? Some well-placed emotional arguments can be very effective if there are also rational arguments going on there as well. And then when it comes down to character or ethics, how is that question being used? How aware does the writer seem to be of ethical questions? How biased? How one-sided? How much consideration has gone in there? And then also, what is your audience expecting? Is your audience going to have a particular ethical position, or is your audience going to have a different ethical position? You need to know this as you're writing your arguments and as you're analyzing. Finally, this last point, and this is where you're really going to make some headway when you're thinking about your argument and how to approach it. What's the common ground? What does everybody care about? Now, again, I'm going to return to that entrenched argument with abortion. Often, people who are making a pro-choice argument will say the common ground that pro-life and pro-choice has is we all want to reduce the number of abortions. So the best way to do this is to have comprehensive sex education classes and to make contraception widely available. This is a common argument within that entrenched debate. It's an attempt to find common ground. Often, that falls on deaf ears because the opposition has a different ethical position. But that's an exploitation, and I mean that in a good way because we're talking about argument. It's an exploitation of an idea of common ground that might sway maybe not the opposition, but somebody who is undecided. So, when you think about common ground, pay attention to that kind of move. Who exactly is it that might be swayed? Maybe it's not the fringe outside positions, but who is up for debate and who is still maybe trying to decide based on things that everybody cares about. Often common ground comes down to ethics, but it could come down to profitability. It could come down to what's feasible. It could come down to what's going to benefit the most people in that middle group. And often there's more than one side, and some of those sides are going to be more flexible than others. All right, you're going to spend some time doing audience analysis this week with some readings that we're taking on parenting and ethical raising of children. You've got some biases probably already. I want you to think about how aware the authors were of their audiences as you read. I want you to take in some other arguments this week, and as you're doing your research for projects 3 and 4, perform this for yourself, perform this for the people who are writing on your subject. If you have any questions about this or applying it going forward, shoot me an email, and I'm looking forward to reading your work.